Dr. Kelly Harden received her PhD in interdisciplinary rural and northern health from Laurentian University in 2017 in Sudbury, Ontario, Canada. Dr. Harding is a research associate with the Canada Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder Research Network, so that's FASD. Dr. Harden is also an adjunct faculty and sessional instructor in the psychology department at Laurentian University and a part-time instructor in the communication studies program at Huntington University. Her research focuses on health services in rural and northern Ontario, with a particular focus on healthcare professionals in training and their preparation regarding FASD. As an FASD researcher, her research interests focus primarily on healthcare professionals' knowledge, self-efficacy, and attitudes regarding FASD and alcohol consumption during pregnancy, families raising children with FASD, and social constructions of popular culture narratives regarding alcohol use during pregnancy and their implications for health promotion and FASD prevention. Dr. Harding has been involved in the field of FASD since 2010, predominantly through research and working with families raising children with FASD. So welcome, Dr. Harding.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Happy Tuesday. I'm so sorry. Oh, forgot to start my webcam. There we go. So hi, everyone. I'm so sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm happy that we got the tech working and I get to speak to you from distance. So I can't hear anything that's happening in the room, but hopefully Angela and Maureen will be able to convey your comments, questions, and thoughts to me while I'm speaking. So I was hoping to have this be interactive and engaging and conversational. So I'm not really sure how that's going to go virtually, but we'll do our best and sort of plug along as we go. So I was really happy to be asked to come and speak about some of the family research that I've been engaged with for the past, I guess, 8 years or so now. And so today I'm going to talk about some of the work that we've been doing with families' lived experience in Ontario, and specifically as that pertains to accessing FASD support groups and experiences with support groups in the province. So the title of my talk is "You're Involved with People Who Are Going Through Exactly the Same Thing, so You Don't Get the Criticism: Caregivers' Lived Experiences with FASD Support Groups in Ontario." So just to get started, I was hoping to pose a couple questions to you. So why do you guys think that FASD support groups are so important? So the purpose of this forum is to talk about, what we can do in terms of creating the group, strategies for you guys. So why are they so important? Why do you think families need them? Okay, provide safety, don't have to explain self or FASD, absolutely. So a sense of understanding other people who know what you're going through, for sure. And then related to that, I'm wondering if anyone would feel comfortable sharing what their best or their worst experience was in a support group. So ideally, they're here to help parents. They're supportive, but certainly that not every experience is necessarily a good experience that families may have with support groups. And I'm going to talk about some of the pros and cons today.
She'll explain it.
So worst are that people generalize. Okay, for sure. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. General rules are shared and opinions are shared that are not always helpful or hopeful. Yes, absolutely. I'm going to speak to that a bit further as well. What about some of the positives? So what are some of the best experiences that you've had? Okay, so kind of the opposite, that in some ways they are hopeful. Maybe provide strategies or solutions for families that are struggling, or give them hope for the future when they hear success stories, positive stories, and building a community that has your back. Absolutely. So knowing that people are going through the same thing, that you have someone that you can share with, bounce ideas off of, and feel supported, because often families talk about feeling very villainized or not supported by others in their community, whether that be neighbors, other family members, and so on. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. So I wanted to start off with this quote that comes from Stephanie, who's an adoptive mother of 2 adult sons with FASD. And I think it really shows why families need support. So she said, "There are days when I don't want to get up, but I have to. There are days that I just want to close the door and have the world go away, but my kids are my life. I would do anything for them. That's what keeps me going. And so remembering at the end of the day that families love their children. They're doing everything that they can to support their children, but it's hard. And so families really need support to be able to deal with those times that may be particularly challenging, or that put extra demands on the resources that they have to be able to manage their children and lead to successful family adaptation. So my husband told me that I should start off with a story, because stories are always a good way to get engaged. So I thought I might tell you a little bit about myself, my research journey, and sort of how I got here. So some of my early work looked at experiences of parenting stress. And we were doing some work comparing families raising children with FASD and families raising children with autism. And actually, without knowing that we were doing this, a lot of families raising children with FASD talked about this comparison and said, you know, families with autism get a lot of support. Why are we not getting the same support for families with children with FASD? And in the research literature, I'm going to speak to it a little bit, but not too much. Because I want to get into the findings, which I think are the really important part. But autism generally considered to be the most stressful for families of all developmental disabilities. But our research actually showing that parents raising children with FASD were experiencing more clinically significant stress, which I'm sure to those of you in the room probably isn't particularly surprising, but good to be validated in the literature, in the research evidence. And so from there, I became really passionate and really interested in looking at the experiences of families raising children with FASD. And so that led to the work that I'm going to talk about today in terms of how are families doing well? So how can we support families to be successful, to reach family adaptation? So a lot of times we do talk about the stress or other things like depression or burden or burnout, but really important to come at it from a strength-based perspective and understand what families are doing well, how they're being supported, and how we can facilitate family support.
5 minutes.
Oh. Sorry, I just got a message that came through. My apologies. And so I'm going to talk about specifically some of the support stuff today related to this work we did on adaptation. And then from the family work, parents told us a lot about how professionals aren't educated about FASD. And that has led into some of the current work that we're doing, looking at the training of healthcare providers and other care providers in terms of their educational preparation around developmental disabilities in general and FASD specifically. So just to give you a bit of context about my work and where I'm coming from and what I'm bringing in to my talk today. So I don't want to go too in-depth into the literature, but just to provide a little bit of context for you. So in terms of the background of family support research, tends to be very negative in its origins. So first generation research presented a pretty bleak picture of family functioning. So like I mentioned, in terms of some of those terminology, so stress, burden, depression, and so on. And this early work focused pretty heavily on mothers. So a lot of mother blaming and judgment here, and not really understanding the family unit as a whole, and certainly understanding that there are other individuals that need to be considered and that come into play when you're thinking about family functioning. And so one of the studies that I always refer to and that I tell my students about is this paper from 1961 by Solnit and Stark that was called Mourning and the Birth of a Defective Child. So coming from very heavy grief literature, again, you'll note the terminology here in terms of defect, and so on. And so parents mourning having a child with a developmental disability. But I think the important message is really that when a family has a child with a disability, the family has a child. And so trying to move away from this really negative perspective of developmental disability. So family research, thankfully, has gone through a period of transition, and certainly is more from a positive strength-based perspective now than it was when that field began. But a lot of the research in general focuses on developmental disability broadly. And so it's important to look at specific disabilities and family experiences because we know that those differ depending on specific differential diagnoses. And so family responses may in turn then be different depending on the disability or the unique challenges of that disability. So thinking about FASD specifically here. And so despite a relatively large body of literature on developmental disabilities in general, and certainly quite a bit on genetic disabilities and autism, there's pretty limited research on FASD, although this is starting to change and we've seen quite an emergence of family literature within the past 5 years or so, which is really exciting. So what we know from the literature about families with children with FASD are that they do experience different challenges and different strengths compared to those of other developmental disabilities, but also that we see increased levels of reported parenting stress. So I wanted to pose a question to you here as well in terms of, what have been some of the biggest stressors for you, or what do you think some of the biggest stressors may be for FASD that differ from other developmental disabilities? Judgment, yes, absolutely. Right, having to explain it over and over again. So a lot of families have talked about that in terms of my child, quote unquote, doesn't look like they have a disability. And so the sense of that they're a bad child or they're a bad parent because their child's behaving poorly, having to explain it to friends, having to explain it to doctors. Having to fight, that's definitely a term that I hear a lot when I work with families. This idea that it's a battle and you constantly have to fight and advocate for your family and for your child. The school system as well, recognizing their needs, absolutely. A lot of the literature has also looked at family characteristics, so things like having fewer family resources to be able to support. So if you're also here thinking about different family types, and also child behaviors. So some research that has looked at child externalizing behaviors, so thinking about things like hyperactivity or aggression, and internalizing behaviors, so things like depression or anxiety, are also significant sources of parenting stress when it comes to children with FASD. It has actually also been described as more rewarding and more difficult. So compared to other disabilities, that families really talk about how positive transformational outcomes happen for them, so that it's made me a better person, it's more appreciative of life and things like that. So acknowledging that it is difficult, but it is also a worthwhile and positive experience raising a child with FASD. We do note that there are enormous challenges in many different domains. And then, as you guys have already mentioned, challenges in dealing with professionals, dealing with the community, and accessing services. And I'm sure to those of you in the room that none of this is particularly surprising to you. But from a research perspective, it's really good to validate those family experiences. But yeah, so certainly probably not surprising to you in the room. But from a research perspective, this is what we know about caregivers' lived experience raising individuals with FASD. So with that, I'm going to transition and talk about some of the research that we've been doing and our results. So we had two main research questions as they pertain to this presentation. So broadly, what is the lived experience of parents raising children with FASD in Ontario? And what supports do parents require to facilitate family adaptation? So specific to that, what are parents' experiences with support, both formal and informal support? So are they accessing support? Is it helpful? Is it not helpful? What are the barriers of facilitators to that support? And I'm going to speak to all of that momentarily with a focus on FASD formal support groups specifically. So we did this using qualitative interviews. So we did a semi-structured interview with families across Ontario, and really we're interested in understanding families' experiences, how they understand their family relationships in regards to the larger community, the FASD community, the disability community, and so on, and what meaning they ascribe to these encounters that they have with other individuals. So we asked families about 22 questions. So you can see some of the questions there in terms of, a starting question of please describe your child to me or describe your family to me. What does a day in your house look like? And then things like describe the diagnostic experience. How did you feel when you received a diagnosis and so on? and then prompting questions. So something like, could you run me through a morning routine, etc. So we access participants across Ontario. As Bestar just noted, they did print off the interview. So if any of you are interested to see the questions, there is a hard copy available there for you. I thought if we had some time at the end, we could even maybe do some of the questions or talk about them together. But I am cognizant.
Please stand by.
Right. But I am cognizant of time, and I've got a few other discussion activities, but please let me know if you would like to chat about that further. So we access participants from across Ontario, and the requirement for participation was at least one child that was diagnosed or suspected of having FASD. So we had a relatively large sample, so families were really excited about coming forward and telling us their stories and talking about their families. And so we had 84 participants that came from 59 families, which included 58 mothers and 26 fathers. And as you can see, wide variety of family types. So we had biological parents, step-parents, foster adoptive parents, as well as actually a couple of grandparents and great-grandparents. So like I said, a lot of variety. And we did try to recruit participants from across Ontario. I don't have the specific breakdown in front of me, but we're also interested in looking at if there were any challenges that were specific to Northern Ontario, where I'm situated, or families who lived in rural communities across the province compared to sort of larger urban centers in Ontario. So before I talk about what families told us and our analysis, I'd like you guys to take a few minutes at your table to discuss what you believe to be some of both the barriers and facilitators of successful FASD support groups. Okay.
So can I just...
Well, keep your barriers and facilitators in mind as I go through the results, and maybe think about how some of the challenges that you talked about are reflected in the results I'm going to present, or maybe perhaps aren't. So with that, I'll talk about three main areas. And so I titled the results, "It's nice to know you're not alone," because really that was the takeaway message that families talked about, were that FASD support groups were instrumental in creating a sense of community and creating a sense of belonging, sense of togetherness, and families overwhelmingly talked about that the pros of support groups outweighed the cons, although they did talk about what some of those challenges were. So I structured the results in three themes. The first being the importance of accessing support groups themselves. And so talking about FASD in-person support groups. So you'll see the quote there, "It was a lifesaver, the FASD group." And then families also talking about the practicality of using online support groups. And so the theme name here being, "She kept me sane that night and I never met her." Families then also talked about the pros and cons of support groups. So some of the things that you guys have already raised already in terms of understanding. So the pros being that ordinary people don't understand, but the cons being also some of the things that you guys have already highlighted, perhaps around sense of hopelessness, lack of positive messaging, and some families saying, you know, I got so depressed when I went to the group. And then lastly, families talked about barriers to support. So for a lot of families who did want to go to FASD support groups, or perhaps had attended one, but the group had stopped running, they talked about some of those barriers, maladaptation, the practicality of being able to actually leave your child at home to get to an in-person FASD support group, or the real lack of support in their respective regions. And so I'm going to talk about each one of these in turn. So the first being the importance of accessing formal support. So it was a lifesaver, the FASD group. So even that terminology itself reflects how important families felt that these groups were, the fact that they actually referred to it as a lifesaver. And so at times they were extremely difficult and they felt like they didn't have support from other people in their lives or nowhere to turn to, that the group was really instrumental in supporting their family unit. And so parents talked about in-person parent-to-parent support groups being the most important source of support, as well as information about FASD. And I talked about this a little bit already, but they talked about it being a sense of community. So somewhere they could go where they didn't feel judged, where if they told stories about things that were happening in their lives, about things that their children did, that they didn't get, strange looks, or they didn't get questions about, why would your child behave in that way, that other people there just understood, and perhaps had the same things going on in their family. And they said, like, oh, this is normal. This is what kids with FASD do. This doesn't just happen in my household. People actually get it. People understand what I'm saying. They also talked as a sense of belonging as a family unit, so that a lot of times parents were able to go to groups together, and also supported their internal relationship by being able to, as a family unit, reach out and access support. And a lot of parents said things like, we belong with them. We belong with that group. And so the terminology here is really important. Like I said, that these are really strong positive emotions that families have associated with the support groups in their regions. And so I've pulled a few different quotes to reflect parents' experiences. And so Claire, who's an adoptive mother to one daughter with FASD, I think of all 59 interviews that I did, that hers actually was the most interesting and entertaining, and you can even see laughter in the quote. And so also using comedy as a coping mechanism too. So I don't know if you guys heard me read the quote, but like I said, in terms of Claire's interview being really interesting and her using comedy, this is a pretty dramatic example of a situation that was happening in her life. But talking about saying something like, my daughter brought a knife to school, and going to a group where people understand that situation, where they can laugh about it, really provided her with a sense of support, that she felt normalized and not judged by her daughter's behavior, whereas in other domains of her life that would be a really difficult thing to explain, something like your daughter bringing a knife to school. On the other hand, where parents talked about online support groups, Claire also talked about using online support in addition to the parent-to-parent in-person support, and talking about really extreme situations that happen at home. So the theme quote being, she kept me sane that night, and I have never met her. And she said, I think the most important thing is to get parents into a support group, even if it's just an internet group. We used to have, back before we had the support group, the in-person group, when she was little, there was an internet chat across North America. There'd be people from all over, and I still keep in contact with them, even though I've never met them. And so talking about the FASD community broadly, that you can access in an online forum, provides another way to access support if you don't have access to an in-person support group in your region, or it's difficult to get to, or because of some of the barriers I'm going to talk about momentarily, really an in-person group not being feasible, but still accessing FASD parent support is critical to supporting family functioning. And I think every single person that we talked to said, you have to have support, you have to access a support group to make it through, and that you can't do it on your own. You need to do it with other people who understand what you're going through. So some of the pros and cons of support groups that families talk about. I'm going to talk about the pros first, and then I'll talk about the cons. So the first pro being ordinary people don't understand. And as I mentioned, you guys mentioned this already a few times with the discussion activities. So Gabrielle, an adoptive mother of an adult daughter with FASD, said, I know one time at a parent support group not long ago, I had complained about something my daughter did, and Elle was there, and she said, gee, when are you going to get it? That's what these people do. And she understood. Ordinary people don't understand. As hard as I've tried for the last 4 years, addiction counselors don't understand. So it's the comfort of knowing people understand. You read the same books, you go to the same conferences. That's my support group. And so a few things going on here. The normalization that I spoke to, so that other families saying, this is what kids with FASD do. Saying like, I don't know why it surprises you that these things are happening. And so sense of understanding that this is what normal family functioning might look like. in a family raising a child with FASD, and knowing that other families are facing the same challenges, as well as some of the practical things that are helpful here. So saying, you're accessing the same resources, the same literature, you're learning the same information. And so it's also an opportunity to talk with other people who understand what's going on about those materials to foster further learning and interaction. Related to that, families talked about that FASD support groups are a good way to access practical solutions for the family. So practical solutions, what you need. You don't need the textbook stuff necessarily. It's nice to have, but when my kid's screaming and standing on the stove, trying to light things on fire, what helps? So again, an example of posing some of the challenges that families are experiencing to the group, saying, this is what happened in my house this week. My child was standing on the stove. If this happens in your house, what do you guys do? Because certainly tangible solutions to something like this situation perhaps aren't available in things like textbooks, as Patricia is talking about. And so really, you have to emphasize the lived experience here of what other families have tried when dealing with these situations in their own lives. As I mentioned, like I said, all parents talked about the importance of connecting with a support group. And so Lisa, an adoptive mother of one adult daughter, said, I would say get to a support group because every 500-page booklet will still not address the particular problem you have with the way your child masturbates in the taxi or whatever it is. That's where you need other parents to talk to. And so again, talking about these specific challenges, these kind of funny life situations that happen, but also parents talking about being rather humiliating and challenging and very stressful, you probably couldn't talk about this with your neighbor or with other people who didn't understand FASD. But the support groups are a forum where you can go and talk about things like your child masturbating in a taxi, and people really don't blink an eye and provide actual practical, tangible solutions that parents might use to try and change that behavior or prevent that situation from happening again. And then Lacey, an adoptive mother of 2 children, also talked about some of the cons, pros and cons. So she said, so once a month there's a meeting, there might be 15 people at the meetings, so that perhaps attendance at support groups is low. But then she went on to say, but in email lists there's over 60. And so that it's sort of this blending of the 2 approaches of having an in-person group and an online group, and saying, like yesterday, there was an email that came through from somebody that used to live here. You can throw out a question and get 5 answers of, well, we did this, try this. And that's coming again, this understanding. So you'll see that word comes up in all of these quotes, that it's a really big emphasis that people understand. There's no judgment. And so that you have access to a wide community of individuals with lived experience, with understanding, who can provide these recommendations and suggestions for families. And so Jody, a stepmother to 1 son with FASD, also talked about the positives. So like I said, overwhelmingly positive feedback about accessing FASD support group. She said it's been really useful because most of them have older kids. So they've been where we are and they have a lot of suggestions and strategies. They know of a lot of services, things to check out. So interestingly, talking about actually going to a support group that has families that have older children was a positive for Jody and her family, because they had something to look forward to of positive stories for the future. So she went on to say, while there are some awful stories, there are some really positive stories of adult kids with FASD who have a job. 1 girl graduated university. And so in this instance, that the support group actually being a sense of hope for the future, that families with younger children have something to look forward to from the wisdom of other caregivers who have older children that can share the success stories and the strengths of their children with FASD. But certainly realizing that this isn't always the case. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment as well. And so again, the takeaway being here, get in touch with the support group. So Lacey, an adoptive mother of 2 younger children with FASD, said that she essentially has learned everything she knows about FASD from other parents. I've learned more from other parents than I have from any professional. And so I can't see your reactions in the room to these quotes, but I am making an assumption that some of these probably resonate with some of the experiences that you have had. I think earlier in the chat, one of the comments was around having to explain it over and over again. And in my experience with families, that often comes with having to explain FASD over and over again to other professionals. And so that other parents just get it. And again, I'm going to keep emphasizing this theme of understanding, that other people understand. And even if you're not necessarily getting the practical solutions, that being in an atmosphere where other people understand what you're going through, don't judge you, your child, or your family unit, in and of itself can be a support and can make families' experiences feel validated. And feel like other people just get it, and that can be a positive feeling. And I see that you're writing lots of head nods, so I'm glad to hear that. And then the other really important piece with accessing support groups is also in keeping family units together. So Ashley, who's an adoptive mother of one, said the good thing that came out of the diagnosis was that we were hooked up with the FASD group. It helped us through because we were very close to 3 adoption disruptions. And so realizing that the behaviors associated with FASD can be extremely challenging for families. As I mentioned, I talked about those stressors. So certainly stressors that come from the community, child behavior stressors, both internalizing and externalizing. And that even though families love their children and try extremely hard to support them, that in some cases the adoption doesn't work out, and there are adoption disruptions and it doesn't happen. But in this case, finding that FASD support group was instrumental in keeping this family together. And so I think that's a really important takeaway point, that again, families feel supported and feel like they have somewhere to go. So with that, I'm going to talk about some of the cons that families talked about, and some of them are in counter to some of the family experiences in relation to the pros. So I got so depressed. So Emily, an adoptive mother of 2 adult daughters, said, I cried. I got so depressed because I realized that I was mourning the loss of her future, of any hope. I was kind of in denial that she'll outgrow it. We'll just find a new treatment, a new therapy. And so for Emily, going to a support group was sort of the realization that her daughter's FASD wasn't going to go away. And so while Jody had talked about the positives of accessing a group that had families raising older children, in Emily's case, this was actually a lot more harmful for her mental functioning, because she talked about hearing those stories really lacks hope. And families talking about how they don't necessarily have hope for the future of their children with FASD. I'm not going to talk about it too much today, but some of the other work that we've done, when we ask parents what they see for the future of their children, they say, I see him in jail. I see him sitting in a jail cell. I see him struggling with substance use issues. A lot of the secondary adverse outcomes that we know related to FASD. And so for parents who may have younger children, this certainly can be very overwhelming, can be depressing when you go to a group and you hear negative stories. And as Emily's saying here, I'm mourning the loss of what I thought my daughter's future might look like. Stacy, an adoptive mother, also of an adult son, said, they're not helpful because you're all just muddling through the same problems. And so while some parents talked about the practical solutions to their child's challenging behaviors being helpful, Stacy here saying that, sometimes it tends to be more, feels like people are just complaining, that there actually really isn't any kind of practical solution that they can try at home. And so you leave the group maybe feeling like you didn't get much from it. You don't feel very hopeful or very positive, and you all just keep muddling through, as she says. And then Peter, along the same line, said, it's not really helpful. I don't really see what it does because you don't come back with more tools or resources. At the end of the day, you're still on your own. And so even with other people understanding that certainly if families are struggling, this family in particular was in a period of crisis when I interviewed them and when I worked with them, that it can be really hard to see the positives or to try those solutions because, as he's saying, you're still on your own. So you can go to a group, you talk to other families, and you come back, but then you still have to deal with the challenges that are happening in your own household. and so may or may not be helpful for different families who are in different states of family adaptation, which is something to consider when creating or running a support group. Okay, so I got 6 minutes left. All right, I'll talk a little bit faster then. The other big thing also being considering family structure. So Whitney, who was a biological mother, said there's no biological parents in the support groups, and I haven't had very positive experiences with support from adoptive parents. I think there are many who are fantastic and who have a lot of knowledge, but it's different. When it comes down to it, it's so different because I think biological parents are dealing with a whole lot of grief and loss. You still have that loss as an adoptive parent because it's not the life you planned, but you didn't do it. So also realizing that there's considerations here about what a focus group might look like depending on family structure. But a lot of biological families that we worked with talking about there isn't a biological parent specific group, that when they go to groups with other parent types that they feel very judged, they feel isolated. And so actually in turn, they don't go to the groups because they don't feel supported, but certainly are still in need of support. So something to keep in mind. And Whitney even said, I would be willing to co-facilitate a group, but it's not really happening in our region. Okay, I'm gonna skip that one. Okay, and then the last thing I'll talk about is barriers to support. So there were 3 main barriers that families talked about that even if they wanted to attend a support group that they couldn't. So the first one being around childcare. So Stephanie said, I would have loved to have gone to groups, but I had no one to look after them. And families talked about that it was really difficult to get respite care, to find someone who was properly educated, who was properly trained to work with an individual or a young child, specifically with FASD. And that a lot of times, especially Stephanie, who was also a single mother, really couldn't get the time away to go to a group. And so thinking about things like perhaps having childcare available at a support group so that families who typically wouldn't be able to come are actually in turn able to access that support. Caitlin talked about, again, not really in the much in the way of support other than online, saying that the support group meets once a month, but it's the same people, so that it's hard keeping members of the group, that maybe the same people are coming back, talking about the same challenge, thinking about some of the cons that parents talked about continually muddling through the same problems. Also talking about the night of the week that they're on. So for her, Caitlin couldn't get away on Mondays. And so she said a lot of families online seem to be having the same experience. And so because she couldn't get to the in-person support, turning more to the online support that I talked about earlier. The other second barrier being actually just not physically having a group in the region. And so Adriana, who was a biological grandmother with 4 children with FASD, who lived in a rural community, said, they actually said if I wanted to start one, they would help me. I tried and nobody's interested. So that either they're not familiar with other families in the region or that families aren't interested in having a support group. Other parents talking about it's an hour drive, so I don't go. Because again, thinking about the time it takes to get there, the time it takes to get home, that all of that is sort of a turnoff to actually getting to the group, or the size of the group. So it's a really, really small group. It would be nice if there was something more. So families really saying that there are these challenges, but I still want to access a group. I still want to find a way to make this work. Marianne talked about being a single parent. I was going to a group that had single parents that were meeting, even though I wasn't a single parent. And interestingly, the group that she was going to was actually all men who were raising their children with FASD. So from a gender perspective, she also talked about she felt like she was intruding on that group and probably what they wanted to talk about. So interesting in thinking about that perhaps at support groups it's predominantly mothers or predominantly women. But remembering that other people in the family unit also need support as well, fathers, siblings, and so on. And the other takeaway here was also, I've talked about family adaptation, and again, I alluded to this when I talked about Peter's quote earlier, but really, if families are in a period of crisis or a period of maladaptation, that probably accessing a support group is the furthest thing from their mind.
And so Peter had said, we're not doing well. Our life is like we can't sleep. You're in crisis. You drive around the corner and your stomach, you feel nauseous because you wonder what's happened. What will have happened? Will the kids be home? And so if you're worried about all of these other stressors and simply just getting by on a day-to-day basis, it can be really challenging to think more long-term or to plan to attend a support group. And perhaps you might even be in a period where you don't feel like sharing the challenges of what's happening in your family unit if you're just trying to do well or to get your family to a place that feels stable. Okay. So I had some case scenarios prepared, which I don't think we're going to have time to get to, but please take them with you and consider them. They are embedded in the slides as well, and I would be happy to chat with you guys after this. My contact information is in here as well, so please reach out if you're interested in more information or want to chat. So I'll just skip through these quickly. And then the last thing I also wanted to note was I've talked a lot about families and a lot about caregivers, and that's my area of expertise. But we've also done some work with siblings. So other individuals in the family unit also talk about we need support. And so this quote comes from Lacey, who was an adopted sibling, who said, I didn't have anyone to talk to. I didn't have resources as a sibling. I didn't have those resources to talk to somebody, so I would leave. So she actually talked about I would run away from my family for days at a time. I didn't want to be around it, and it would take a few days for my sibling to calm down. And so actually avoiding their family as a coping mechanism to try and deal with the challenges of what were happening. And so thinking about that siblings also perhaps need their own support group where they can talk about their challenges as a sibling to an individual with FASD, because certainly the challenges likely are similar, but also different to the challenges that their parents are experiencing. So with that, I'll just wrap up quickly. So we know that the lived experience for parents raising children with FASD is complex. More broadly in relation to this project, we do see that parents are able to balance their demands with their capabilities, in this instance with accessing FASD formal support in the form of either an in-person support group or an online support group. The problems that are faced by families tended to be similar regardless of family structure, but there are notable differences when it came to accessing support. So like I talked about with Whitney's experience, particularly when it came to support for biological caregivers. So there's a clear demonstrated need for formal support groups for parents, also regardless of whether or not their child is formally diagnosed. So a lot of parents with children with suspected FASD talked about it being really critical for them as well, also in terms of learning about FASD. When forming a support group, leaders should take into account the additional needs or barriers that families may face in participating, including their own needs as well. So some of the families that we talked to who were actually leaders of their own support group said, I'm there to lead others and talk about their challenges, but I actually don't ever get a chance to talk about my own experiences. So remembering that you as a group leader also need support and having someone to turn to for your support. And so regardless of the form of support, it's clear that parents need help to identify and manage their child's FASD through peer support and recommendations. And I'll just sort of end on this point here, that it's absolutely exhausting, but support is key. So that's really the takeaway from my presentation that I'm sure reaffirms why you are here in the room today and why you're here to talk about this. But parents are asking for it and they want it, and FASD support is so critical to facilitating family adaptation.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you guys so much. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there in person. I'm really sad. I had lots of fun props and activities and discussion, but I hope this was still worthwhile. And my contact information is here, and I would be happy to chat with any of you, via email or by phone. So please reach out.
It was definitely worthwhile, Kelly. Can you hear me? Yeah, it was definitely worthwhile. We're very grateful that you were able to participate, and we do apologize for the technical difficulties. But we did get the bulk of it, so that's really good. And I think that you helped us to realize that despite some of our difficulties, even engaging families and connecting and starting these support groups is sometimes it's tricky. But the need is so great. And I think that if we do build them, and if we do bring that, the meals and the warmth and the family support and the the trust that hanging out with like-minded individuals is so important. I think that if we keep doing that, we will see amazing outcomes and much better for folks. It was interesting that you said about things like barriers, you know, making sure that childcare, if at all possible, that you make those partnerships to be able to allow that. One of the things that we did when we ran the group in London, honestly, out of all the goals that we had, the number one goal of that group was to make sure that no child got kicked out. So it was all about a successful social experience for both the children, but the mums and dads needed to know that they could actually rest and have a coffee and know that their kids were understood and appreciated for the gifts that are within. Because truly, it was amazing to see. And I heard things like, you know, one little girl was saying something about crying at school, and the little guy that was sitting beside her said, "I never cry here." And that brought me to tears, because it was one of the very few environments that he just never had to cry, because everybody got him. And the families just loved it. So I think that, you know, emphasizing on that lived experience, and also, you know, there's potential for good facilitation to really be inclusive and to reduce that, that stigma attached to biological families as well. But you definitely have to work it. If you've got a mixed crew, you have to work it. You have to check your own biases. You have to really be prepared to, you know, to let go of some of your own anger, maybe some of your own frustration, and some of your own guilt as well, depending on what role you are. But there's definitely work to be done outside of the group, and let the support group augment all of that, right? So anyways, thank you so much. You were awesome.
And safe travels home to all of you.
Yes, all right. Thank you again.
Thanks. Bye now.